Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
The air buzzed with the sounds of distant hover cars zipping through the towering skyline. Neon lights flickered, advertising everything from intergalactic cuisine to universal dating apps that promise love beyond the stars. The Orion Nexus spaceport was a chaotic blend of cultures, humans, aliens, cyborgs, and everything in between, moving through its massive corridors amid the rush of species from every corner of the galaxy. Darren leaned against the counter of a cheap food stall, chewing on a steaming skewer of grilled meat from some unknown species. The spicy, sweet taste exploded on his tongue, and he grinned, savoring the meal. "Hey Zorik, this stuff's still legal," he joked, tossing a glance at the vendor, a four-armed reptilian with a suspicious look. Zorik grumbled in response. "You ask too many questions, human. Pay and eat." Darren chuckled, sliding over the credits before turning to head toward the nearest restroom. He'd spent all day working as a cargo hauler, lifting and transporting goods between interstellar clients. The last thing he needed was to hold it in before catching a long ride home. The restroom doors slid open automatically as he stepped inside. Dim stereo lighting reflected off the metallic walls, and the faint hum of air filtration systems filled the space. Darian took his place at the sink, rolling his shoulders as he ran water over his hands. That's when the soft, clinking sound of footsteps caught his attention. He glanced up at the mirror and nearly choked on his breath. A tall, impossibly elegant figure stood near the entrance. She had silver-blue skin that shimmered under the bathroom lights like liquid metal. Strange bioluminescent markings traced elegant patterns across her cheeks and forehead, glowing softly with each breath. She took two long curved horns extended backward from her head, adding to her otherworldly beauty. And those eyes, sharp violet and glowing faintly, were filled with confusion. Darren stared. She stared back. He blinked. She blinked. An awkward silence stretched between them before Darian cleared his throat and gave an easygoing smirk. Hate to break it to you, but this is the men's bathroom." The alien woman frowned, tilting her head slightly as if trying to process his words. Then, in a voice smooth and refined, she replied, "I do not understand you. You are mistaken, human. This is clearly a cleansing chamber." Darren snorted. "Yeah, a men's cleansing chamber." The woman's brows furrowed, her glowing markings shifting from a soft blue to a muted shade of pink, almost as if she were blushing. Darren fought back a chuckle. "Oh, this was going to be fun." The embarrassment sets in. The alien woman glanced around quickly, her fingers twitching in what seemed like mild panic. As she hesitated, her voice losing its regal tone, "I was unaware that your species divide such facilities based on gender. In my world, there are only shared cleansing spaces." Darian said, folding his arms. "So what exactly brought you to this one?" She bit her lip, a small but oddly human-like gesture of embarrassment, and exhaled sharply. "I was following a guide, but I must have misunderstood the directions." "Clue?" Darian repeated. The alien woman shifted uncomfortably, her glowing skin darkening further as she realized the mistake. "Very well," she finally said, regaining a bit of her composure. "I shall take my leave." She turned abruptly, only to nearly crash into the wall beside the exit. Darian let out a laugh before he could stop himself. "Oh yeah, real smooth." The alien woman whipped her head around, glaring at him. Silence, human. Her embarrassment only amused him more, but then something unexpected happened. The alien woman stepped back from the door, pressing her hand to her chest, breathing deeply. Her bioluminescent markings flickered, rapidly shifting into a deep purple hue. Darian raised an eyebrow. "You good?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at him, her gaze unreadable. Then she did something odd. She took a step back and slightly lowered her head, her lips parting slightly. Darren smirked, finding the whole thing amusing. "What, some kind of apology gesture?" The woman stiffened. "Apology? Yeah, like on Earth, when people bump into each other, they say sorry." There was a long, tense pause. Then, in a slow, horrified whisper, She said, "You mean this is not the universal gesture of courtship initiation?" Darian's smirk froze. Wait, what? Before he could process her words, the alien woman surged forward, her lips brushing against his in the lightest, most fleeting kiss imaginable. Darian's mind went blank for a split second. All he could focus on was the unexpected warmth of her lips. They were soft, warmer than a human's, and had an almost electrifying tingle to them, as if tiny energy currents pulsed beneath her skin. Then it was over. The alien reeled back, as if she just touched fire. Her glowing markings flashed in a violent shade of gold, pure panic. Darian, meanwhile, stood completely frozen. What the hell was that? He finally blurted. The alien woman covered her mouth with both hands, her glowing eyes wide with horror. "No, no, no. No, this cannot be happening," she whispered. Darren took a step back, alarmed by her reaction. "Okay, what exactly just happened?" The alien woman squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body tense. "In my culture," she said slowly, voice trembling, "a first kiss is a symbol of binding courtship. It is irrevocable." Darian blinked. "Come again." She snapped her head toward him, looking utterly mortified. "You human have just claimed me as your mate." Darian stared at her, brain struggling to catch up. Then, very slowly, a grin crept onto his face. "Well, I'll be damned," the alien woman groaned, burying her face in her hands. "This is a disaster." Darren, still amused despite the sheer absurdity, crossed his arms and smirked. "Hey, don't look at me. You're the one who kissed me," she gasped, clearly ready to explode at him. But before she could, the sound of heavy footsteps suddenly echoed from outside. "Valerie," a deep, commanding voice boomed. The alien woman whipped around in terror. "No, not now." Darren's grin faded in instantly. "Who the hell is that?" Valerie turned back to him, eyes frantic. "My family sent a guard to retrieve me. If they find out about this," she gestured between them, "there will be consequences." Darren, despite himself, felt a thrill of excitement creep. "And so what you're saying is we just became intergalactic star-crossed lovers by accident?" Viri glared at him. "This is not a joke." Darren and shrugged. "Kind of feels like one." And then the bathroom door slammed open. A massive, heavily armored alien warrior stepped inside, and he did not look happy. The bathroom door slammed open with a loud whoosh, the sound echoing off the metallic walls. Darren instinctively took a step back, his hands halfway raised in reflex. The alien woman, Valerie, as he had just learned, went rigid, her glowing violet eyes wide with panic. The figure that entered was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a muscular frame, clad in dark, intricately designed battle armor. His deep-set, burning yellow eyes locked onto Valerie, immediately, his expression sharp and unwavering. "Valerie." The warrior growled, his voice like rolling thunder. Valerie swallowed hard. "Chorus," she muttered, stiffening like a child caught sneaking out past curfew. Darren glanced between the two, rubbing the back of his neck. "So, who's the big guy?" Valerie shot him a glare, whispering fiercely, "That assures my family's elite protector. He has sworn to ensure my well-being." Shiori took a single step forward, and Darian immediately understood the rest, "and also to crush any threat to my honor." Darian whistled under his breath. "Oh, fantastic honor. That's never gotten anyone killed before." Shore's glowing yellow gaze flickered to Darian, scanning him as if deciding whether he was worth squashing. His lip curled in disgust. "This human is the one you were seen with?" Shias demanded, his tone dripping with disdain. Valerie visibly winced. "Shias, please. It is not. It is exactly what I was told." Chorus's expression darkened. A noble daughter of the Raylar bloodline, openly displaying affection with a lowly tan. Duran raised a brow. "Wow, lowly, that's harsh, buddy." Valerie shot Duran a "shut up before you get yourself killed" look. Joris's massive arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable, but clearly displeased. "What has he done to you?" Valerie hesitated. Darren grinned. "Oh, you know, nothing major, just a little accidental bathroom bonding, pretty normal stuff." Valerie elbowed him sharply in the ribs, making him cough. Zor's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Valerie hesitated again, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "Shush. I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice softer than before. "I misinterpreted a social cue from this human, and She stopped, her glowing markings shifting, a deeper hue of violet, her breath catching Joris's expression remained cold and calculating. You kissed him very visibly. Flinched Giori, closed his eyes for a long, slow second, inhaled deeply, then reopened them. Then the bond is sealed. Viari whipped her head up, panic flashing across her face. No, it was an accident. Orris's jaw clenched. Roser customs are not flexible. Valari, a first kiss is a courtship bond. Darren, finally putting the last pieces together, blinked in realization. Wait, he said, slowly lifting a hand. So you're telling me that because she kissed me even by mistake, we're what, soulmates now? Valari turned to him, her expression a mix of horror and frustration. Not soulmates, she snapped, but bound by custom. A kiss is a sign of formal romantic intent among my people. It signifies the beginning of a courtship, one that is traditionally seen as irrevocable. Darren let out a low whistle. So basically you're stuck with me now. Valeri's glowing markings flared a bright shade of pinkish purple, her hands clenching into fists. She groaned, pressing a hand to her forehead. This is a disaster. Chores, meanwhile, had yet to move. His towering form remained still, but his burning yellow eyes were locked onto Darien with renewed intensity. So Xorus rumbled, stepping forward. You have two options, human. Darren tilted his head. Oh, cool, love options. Hit me. Valari visibly tensed. Giori, the warrior, ignored her. Option 1. Shores continued. You formally accept the bond and assumed the role of Valari suitor. Darren grinned. Not going to lie, kinda tempted. Valari groaned. Shores didn't react to the joke. Option 2. He continued, his voice lowering dangerously. You face the consequences of dishonoring a noble woman. Darren's grin wavered slightly, and those would be Joris's massive fists flexed at his sides. Trial by combat. Darren blinked. Excuse me. Valari whirled toward Giori, her glowing skin shifting to a deep, irritated red. That is unnecessary, she hissed. Giori didn't so much as glance at her. It is tradition, he countered, and this human has stolen a kiss from a noble. She kissed me, Darren pointed out. Xorus, his gaze narrowed. Did you resist? Well, no, but then you accepted the bond. Darren stared. You guys really need to update your relationship policies. Valari exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. This is absurd. Darren, meanwhile, tapped his chin. Okay, but hear me out. What if we just ignore the whole thing? Pretend it never happened. Shore's expression darkened. That is not how things work in the Rusar culture. Darien turned to Valari. Your culture sounds exhausting. Valari said. You have no idea. Darien exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Okay, let's say I accept the whole courtship thing. He gestured vaguely at Valari. Then what does that actually mean? Valari hesitated. It would mean temporary engagement. Darren stared at her. Temporary engagement until we determine compatibility, Valari muttered, clearly mortified. Darien crossed his arms. And what if I don't accept? Giori cracked his knuckles loudly, the sound like breaking bones. Darien winced. Ah, right. Valari's gaze flickered toward him. She was tense, frustrated, but beneath it all there was something else, a hint of curiosity. Darren tilted his head at her. You really don't want to be stuck with me, huh? Very ska. You are reckless, impulsive, and insufferably arrogant. Darren grinned. Yeah, but I'm also kind of fun. Viri rolled her eyes, debatable. Darren turned back to Giori. All right, big guy. You want an answer? Chorus nodded. Darren stretched out his arms, his signature smirk creeping back onto his face. I accept. Valari gasped. You what? Darren winked at her. Come on, princess. Let's see where this little accident takes us. Valari stared at him, her glowing markings flickering uncertainly. Sheer, meanwhile, merely grunted. Then it is done. Darren clapped his hands together. Great. So do I get a cool space of boyfriend badge or something? Valari looked like she wanted to throw him into orbit. Giori exhaled. This is going to be a long trial period. Darien smirked. Oh, don't worry, I plan to make it interesting. The Orion Nexus spaceport's air buzzed with activity, yet within the confines of the restroom an eerie silence had settled. Darren stood there, arms crossed, grinning like a man who had just won a free vacation. He didn't sign up for. Valari, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to strangle him with her bare hands. Goris, her towering warrior guardian, had accepted Darren's declaration without so much as a second thought, as if the outcome was inevitable. Valari finally found her voice, spinning toward Darien. With a furious expression, "You cannot be serious," she hissed her bioluminescent markings, flaring a deep violet absolute disbelief. Darren smirked, rolling his shoulders. "Hey, not my fault. Your customs are so strict. What, you wanted me to take the trial by combat option?" Viri opened her mouth, then immediately closed it, glaring at him. "Instead, that is beside the point." Shore cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Your acceptance means you are now bound to the Relar courtship process. There will be expectations." Darian raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, like what?" Chorus's golden eyes narrowed. "You will be expected to prove your worth, to demonstrate that you are a capable and honorable mate for Viri." Darren grinned. "So basically, I got to impress the in-laws." Valari groaned loudly, pressing her palms to her face. "Sore, this is a disaster. You should not have allowed this." "It was his choice," Shiora said simply. Valari's hands curled into fists at her sides, her glowing markings flaring erratically. Darren, enjoying her reaction far too much, leaned toward her slightly. "Come on, admit it. You're at least a little curious to see how this plays out." Valari turned her heated gaze on him. "I would rather launch myself into a black hole." Darien chuckled. "That's not a no." Giori sighed, turning toward Veer like it or not the bond was initiated. "You must move forward or risk shaming your house." Valari tensed at those words. Duran, watching the exchange, tilted his head slightly. He could see it, Valari's conflicted expression, the tightness in her shoulders. She wasn't just frustrated, she was afraid. Duran's smirk faded slightly as realization struck. She doesn't just hate the situation, she's scared of what it means for her. "Status all right," he said suddenly, drawing both their gazes back to him. "Then how about a deal?" Valari narrowed her eyes. "A deal?" Darren nodded. "Yeah. Instead of going full intergalactic husband mode, why don't we take things slow, actually get to know each other before either of us decides to freak out?" Valari blinked. "But the bond is a problem for Futurist," Duran interrupted with a grin. "For now, we can just call it a trial period, a little test drive, yes, if you will." Valari stared at him, clearly unsure whether to be insulted or intrigued. "You are proposing a temporary courtship?" "Exactly." Darien said. "That way nobody dies, and we figure out if this whole accidental romance thing is even worth considering." Shiori folded his arms, assessing Darien carefully. "And if after the trial it is deemed unfit?" Darren shrugged. "Then Valari goes back to her noble fancy life, and I go back to being a charming rogue with questionable luck." Valari remained silent. Darien raised an eyebrow at her well-sound fair. Valari's markings pulsed softly, flickering between shades of violet and deep blue. Finally, after a long moment, she sighed. "Fine." Darien grinned. "See, that wasn't so hard." Valari shot him a dark look. "Oh, not make me regret this." Darien winked. "No promises." Zoris, though still seemingly unimpressed, gave a short nod. "Then it is settled. The trial begins immediately." Darren clapped his hands together. "All right, so first date, do we do fancy alien restaurants, or should I introduce you to the wonders of human street food?" Viri groaned. This was going to be a long trial. The spaceport's loud, bustling corridors became the backdrop for one of the strangest dates Darren had ever been on. Viri, despite her cold demeanor, carried herself with unshakable grace. Everything about her screamed nobility. The way she walked, the way she observed her surroundings, even the way she scowled at food stalls like they were personally offending her. Darien, on the other hand, had a different approach, so he said, gesturing toward a hovercart vendor grilling skewers of sizzling exotic meats, "I figure, if we're stuck together, we should start with the important stuff." Valari frowned. "Important?" Darien grinned. "Food." Valari's expression flattened. "You cannot be serious." Darren smirked. "Oh, I am very serious. You've probably only ever had fancy diplomatic meals, right?" Valari hesitated. "My family does place emphasis on refined dining experiences." "Exactly, which means you've never had real food." Valari's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And street food is real food?" Darien grabbed a skewer from the vendor, handing over a few credits before offering it to her. "Try it." Viri hesitated. Darren waggled the skewer playfully. "What scared?" Valari's markings flickered, but she snatched the skewer from his hand without breaking eye contact. Darien smirked. She took a slow, careful bite. A moment of silence. Then her eyes widened. Darren leaned in. "Good, right?" Valari hurriedly masked her reaction, swallowing quickly. "It is Acceptable, Darren chuckled. That's noble speak, for I love it, Valari huffed. Turning away, but not before taking another bite. Darren's grin widened. Progress as the day went on. Darren found himself genuinely curious about Vi. She spoke of her home world, a place filled with floating citadels and bioluminescent gardens. She described her duties as a noble, the expectations pressed upon her since birth, yet there was an underlying tension in her words, a quiet resentment toward the life she was meant to lead. Darren didn't press, but he filed it away later as they sat beneath the neon lights of a bustling city sector. Viri folded her arms and eyed him carefully. You are not what I expected, human. Darren tilted his head. Yeah, what did you expect? Valari studied him, something cruder, unrefined, reckless. Darren smirked. Well, you got 1 out of 3 right. Viri let out a small, unexpected laugh. It was soft, almost genuine. Darren's smirk faltered slightly. He liked that sound a lot. The streets of Orion Nexus were alive with energy. Hovered bikes zipped between floating billboards. Neon signs flickered above bustling alleyways, and merchants of every species haggled in a mix of human and alien tongues. The air carried a mix of tantalizing food smells, burning fuel, and the faint metallic tang of high-tech infrastructure amidst this chaotic yet fascinating backdrop. Fiery and Darren walked side by side, navigating the crowded pathways. Though they had agreed to the trial period, the tension between them was still palpable. Valari held herself rigidly upright, her every movement precise and calculated. She scanned the surroundings as if she were on a military mission, her bioluminescent markings pulsing softly with unreadable emotions. Darren, on the other hand, strolled with an effortless swagger, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, occasionally tossing grins and winks at passing alien women just to mess with Vieri. Of course, Vieri, for her part, ignored him. Mostly, you keep staring at people, she muttered at one point, her tone slightly disapproving. Darren grinned. It's called people watching, helps me read a crowd. Valari frowned. Humans are so chaotic. Your species thrives on randomness. Darren smirked. And your species thrives on rules. How's that working out for you? Laurie glared at him, but said nothing. Instead, she focused on observing their surroundings, taking in the flashing lights, the fast-moving hover vehicles, and the sheer variety of life. Darren watched her reaction closely, noting how her fingers twitched slightly when she passed a group of laughing humans, or how her markings brightened when she spotted a street performer playing an alien string instrument. Despite her rigid demeanor, there was a curiosity in her, a part of her that was interested in the world beyond her own traditions, and Darren, he found himself enjoying her reactions far more than he expected. All right, Darren said after a while, turning to face Vi. If we're stuck in this trial period, we might as well learn about each other's worlds. Valari raised an eyebrow. And how do you suggest we do that? Darren grinned. Simple, we take turns. You teach me something about your culture, and I teach you something about mine. Valari exhaled slowly, considering the offer. Fine. Darren clapped his hands together. Great. I'll go first. Lesson 1, the art of sarcasm. Valari frowned. But the art of it exactly, Darren said. It's how humans communicate when we want to say something but also not say it. Like when someone asks if I enjoy getting involved in alien courtship rituals, I can say, oh yeah, I love it, it's my favorite thing ever. Valari blinked. That is confusing. Darren grinned. Yuck, get used to it. Valari rolled her eyes. Very well. My turn. She straightened, regaining her usual regal posture. On my home world, our emotions are shared through physical touch. The depth of a relationship is reflected in how freely one allows contact. Darren raised an eyebrow. Wait, so like if you touch someone's hand, they know what you're feeling? Valari nodded. Yes, a mere brush of fingers can convey simple emotions, joy, sadness, anger. A full embrace is a rare and deeply personal act. Kisses, as you have learned, are a bonding gesture meant to seal intent. Darren whistled. Damn, so handshakes must be super intense for you guys. Valari frowned. What is a handshake? Darren immediately grabbed her hand, clasping it firmly before giving it a small shake. Valari's entire body went rigid, her markings flared an intense violet, and she let out a small gasp as if the simple gesture had shocked her system. Darren blinked in surprise. Whoa, are you okay? Valari jerked her hand away. Breathing slightly unevenly, that was she swallowed unexpected, Darien smirked it. I just emotionally overload you with a handshake fury, shot him a deadly glare. Do that again, and I will break your wrist, Darien chuckled noted, but even as Valerie tried to compose herself, Darien could tell she had felt something, and maybe, just maybe, she hadn't hated it as they walked. Something subtle change. Between them, Valerie no longer kept a full arm's length away. Darien no longer saw her as just a cold, uptight noble. They were still fundamentally different. But for the first time since their awkward bathroom kiss, something felt balanced between them. Darien, ever the opportunist, decided to push his luck, so if emotions can be shared through touch. He mused, tilting his head toward her. What did you feel when I grabbed your hand? Valerie immediately stiffened her. Markings flickering between violet and blue. That is none of your concern, Darien grinned. Oh, so it was something, Valerie huffed, turning away. Your arrogance is insufferable, yet here we are, Darien said, walking beside her. With no sign of stopping, Valerie exhaled heavily, looking up at the skyline. This world is strange, she admitted after a moment, but fascinating. Darien smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. For the first time, Valerie didn't argue. The neon lights reflected off Valerie's silver blue skin, casting her in an otherworldly glow. Her horns framed her elegant face perfectly, and the occasional flicker of light from her glowing markings only made her more mesmerizing. Darien wasn't blind, he knew. She was stunning, but this was the first time he had actually found himself drawn to her, not just for her looks, but for the way she carried herself, the quiet curiosity beneath her sharp exterior, the way she spoke with unshakable confidence, yet clearly felt out of place. Valerie, perhaps sensing his gaze, turned toward him. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You are staring, Darien grinned, observing big difference. Valerie rolled her eyes, but said nothing. For a brief moment there was no sarcasm, no snark, no insults, just the quiet buzz of the city and the shared space between them. And for the first time neither of them rushed to fill the silence. The streets had quieted as the artificial night settled over Orion Nexus, the neon lights flickering in their endless glow. The air was cooler now, the sense of sizzling food stalls replaced by the crisp metallic hum of the spaceport's power grid. Darien and Valerie had been walking for longer than either intended, their steps falling into a rhythm neither acknowledged. Valerie remained poised, her back straight, her bioluminescent markings dimming to a calmer hue. She had learned enough about human culture for the night, she decided, and yet, when Darien turned to her with that infuriatingly confident smirk, she didn't immediately shut him down. So how's your first date with a human treating you? He teased, shoving his hands into his pockets. Valerie exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly. This is not a date. Darien clicked his tongue. We walked together, ate food, learned about each other's cultures. Sounds like a date to me. Valerie's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. She had never experienced a night like this before, and as much she wanted to dismiss it, there was a strange comfort in the lack of formality on her homeworld. Every interaction was dictated by duty, by the expectations of her family, her people. But here in this neon-lit city there were no rules. And yet the lack of structure made her uneasy. Darien watched her in silence, his usual playful demeanor softening just a little. You know, he mused, for someone who's supposed to be bound to me by accident, you don't seem to hate it as much as you did a few hours ago. Valerie stiffened at that, her markings flaring brighter for a brief moment before she suppressed her reaction. I still consider this an unfortunate situation, sure, Darien said, nodding sagely. That's why you're still here instead of running off with your oversized bodyguard. Valerie narrowed her eyes, but this time there was no true heat in her gaze. I am here because this is a trial period, one that I intend to see through for the sake of my honor. Darien hummed. Right, and absolutely no part of you is intrigued by me at all. None, she said flatly. Darien smirked. Liar. Valerie inhaled sharply, turning her face away before she could betray the truth. He was right. It was fascinating the way he carried himself, how effortlessly he moved through his world. He was reckless, unpredictable, unshaked by duty in a way that was both infuriating and enviable. She didn't know what to do with that realization. Darien, sensing her inner turmoil, leaned in slightly. You ever had a guy flirt with You before Valeri stiffened, of course. I have my status has attracted many suitors, Darren chuckled. Right. But I mean, has anyone ever flirted with you just for fun? No courtship, no political gain, just because they think you're beautiful. Valeri's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer because the truth was no, she had been admired, yes. She had been desired as a noble woman, as a symbol of prestige. But never as just Valeri. No one had ever spoken to her without calculation, without considering the weight of her lineage. No one had ever looked at her the way Darren did now, with interest that was genuine, unburdened, and shamelessly bold. Darren tilted his head. No comeback, that's new. Valeri clenched her jaw. You are insufferable, he grinned. And yet you keep hanging around me. She turned to leave, but as she did, Darren reached out and lightly brushed his fingers against her wrist. Just a fleeting touch, nothing more. Valeri sucked in a sharp breath. The sensation rushed through her, a ripple of warmth. She was entirely unprepared for her markings, flared brightly, too brightly, giving her away instantly. Darren noticed his eyes flickered with amusement. But for once he didn't tease her about it. Instead, he leaned in just a fraction closer, his voice lowering slightly. You felt that, didn't you? He murmured. Valeri's throat was dry. That was nothing. Darren smiled. Sure. She forced herself to turn away, to walk ahead, to ignore the way her skin still tingled from the briefest contact. But her mind betrayed her, because in that single moment she knew Darren wasn't just someone she was forced to spend time with. He was dangerous. Not in the way Shus was physically intimidating, threatening with sheer strength. Darren was dangerous in a way she hadn't encountered before, because for the first time in her life, she was starting to wonder, what if she didn't want to end this trial period? What if for once she wanted to see what happened if she didn't follow the rules? And that thought terrified her far more than any courtship bond ever could. The Orion Nexus spaceport had settled into its artificial night cycle, with the city's neon glow still pulsing against the darkened skyline. Despite the quiet hum of life around them, an undeniable tension crackled in the space between Darren and Valeri. It had started with an accidental kiss, a misunderstanding that should have been resolved. But now it was something else entirely. Valeri walked ahead, her pace quick and deliberate, as though she was physically trying to outpace her own emotions. Her bioluminescent markings, usually a soft glow, flickered erratically. She was frustrated not just with Darren, but with herself, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to resist Darren ever. The opportunist kept pace beside her, his usual smirk still present, but his eyes held something sharper now, something curious and intense. He had seen the way she reacted to his touch, he had seen her moment of hesitation, and now he wanted to push just a little more. You sure you don't want to slow down? He teased, effortlessly keeping up with her hurried strides. You're walking like you're being chased. Valeri exhaled sharply. I am not accustomed to uncertainty. Darren chuckled. You're really struggling with this, huh? She came to an abrupt halt, spinning toward him. I was raised with purpose, Darren, with rules, with expectations. My future was clear. And now she let out a frustrated breath, shaking her head. Now I am forced into a trial courtship with a human who is reckless, impulsive, and refuses to take anything seriously. Darren grinned. You say that like it's a bad thing. Valeri's eyes flashed. It is it? Darren stepped closer, invading her space just slightly. Or is it just different from what you're used to? She held her ground, but her markings betrayed her, shifting between violet and blue colors of conflicted emotions. Darren lowered his voice. Be honest. If I were one of your noble suitors, stiff, formal, by the book, would you even be interested in this at all? Valeri opened her mouth to argue, but stopped, because he was right. If Darren had treated this like some formal ritual, if he had acted like the suitors her family had chosen for her in the past, she would have rejected him outright. She had spent her whole life around men who bowed, spoke, and rehearsed phrases, and followed protocol like a script. But Darren, he wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't intimidated by her status, by her power. He challenged her, tested her, made her feel things she shouldn't feel. And the worst part, she didn't hate it. Darren watched her carefully, as if he could see her inner turmoil unraveling in real time. I think, he said slowly, you don't actually hate this as much as you pretend to. Valeri narrowed her eyes. You are insufferable. And yet, he murmured, stepping even closer, you haven't walked The way her breath hitched because he was right again. She should have ended this, should have dismissed him, called for shores, declared the courtship trial invalid. But she hadn't. Instead, she was still here, standing beneath the glow of neon lights with a human who made her question everything. Darian's smirk faded slightly, his voice dropping lower. Do you even know what you want, Valerie? Her hands clenched at her sides, as if physically stopping herself from reaching for him. And then her communicator buzzed. Valerie blinked, the moment shattering like glass. With a rushed motion, she pressed the device on her wrist, her face immediately tightening as a familiar deep voice filled the space around them. Valerie, it was Shiori's. Darian leaned back, slightly watching as Villar's entire demeanor shifted. Shiori, she said, regaining her usual calm and composed tone. What is it? You are required to return immediately. Valerie frowned. Why? There was a pause before Shiori spoke again. Your family has summoned you. Word of your association with the human has reached them. Valerie went still. Darian's jaw tightened slightly, reading the tension in her face. They Valerie exhaled, her markings dimming. They know, they suspect, Sori corrected, and they are not pleased. If you do not return soon, they may take matters into their own hands. Darian grimaced. Well, that doesn't sound ominous at all. Valerie ignored him. How long do I have? Not long. You need to decide whether you intend to fight for this courtship or let it be erased before it can be recognized officially. Darian raised an eyebrow. Wait, erased? Valerie's jaw tightened. If my family formally rejects this trial, they can declare it invalid, meaning this entire situation will be undone. Darian frowned. That's an option only if I agree to their terms, she muttered. Darren tilted his head, his gaze piercing into her. So what you're saying is if you go back now and agree with them, this whole thing has never happened? Valerie hesitated. Yes. Darren exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Dan, talk about a way to kill the mood. Valerie turned toward him, her expression unreadable. This is not about us, Darian. It is about my duty to my people. Darian stared at her for a moment. And then he said without a hint of sarcasm, is it? Valerie flinched, because that was the real problem, wasn't it? She didn't know anymore. She had spent her whole life believing she was meant to follow a certain path, that everything had been decided for her. But Darian had shown her something else, something reckless and unpredictable and terrifyingly enticing, a choice of freedom she had never allowed herself to even consider. And now she had to decide. Darian, watching the storm of emotions flickering behind her glowing violet eyes, let out a slow breath. So, what's it going to be? Princess Valerie held his gaze, her markings pulsed softly, shifting between colors, uncertain, hesitant, on the verge of something irrevocable. And then finally she spoke. I don't know. Darian grinned, but this time it was softer, more real. Well, that's progress at least. Valerie exhaled, her frustration returning. This is not progress. Darian stepped closer, lowering his voice. It is if you're thinking about. She hated that he was right again before she could say another word. Gore's voice cut through the communicator once more. Valerie, they are sending someone to retrieve you. You must decide now. Darren arched a brow. Looks like your ride's on the way. Valerie swallowed hard, her hands clenching at her sides. She had spent her entire life following orders, and for the first time she didn't want to. Her glowing eyes flickered up to meet Darian once more, and in that moment she made her decision. We run. Darian's grin widened. I was hoping you'd say that. Valerie grabbed his wrist, her touch sending a pulse of warmth through him, and together they ran into the city toward an uncertain future. Neither of them had ever expected. The streets of Orion Nexus blurred around them as Valerie and Darian ran. The cool night air rushed past, carrying the scent of ozone and burning plasma from distant hovercrafts. The neon glow of the city flickered across Vi's silver-blue skin, making her look almost ethereal, a celestial being caught between two worlds. Darren had no idea where they were going, but neither did she. All he knew was that she had chosen to run with him. Behind them, the deep, thunderous steps of Joris's enforcers echoed through the alleyways. Valerie's family had wasted no time. Of course, they hadn't. A noble daughter tangled in a forbidden courtship with a human. That was the kind of scandal that got people erased from history. Valerie, Duran huffed, dodging a stack of abandoned crates as they cut through a narrow passage. Not that I'm complaining, But did we have an actual plan when you said run not yet? Valerie admitted, her grip tightening around his wrist as she pulled him forward, weaving through the neon-lit corridors like she had done this 1,000 times before. But we need to get off-world. Darren winced. Right, no big deal, just escape a planetary security lockdown, run by your very powerful, very scary alien family. Sounds easy. Valerie shot him a sharp glare over her shoulder. Would you rather go back? Darren smirked. Never said that. I just like to point out when we're doing something insane. Her markings flickered with something between frustration and amusement, but she didn't reply. Instead, she pulled him sharply into a side corner, pressing her back against the wall. As she peeked around the edge, Darren found himself unintentionally pressed against her, his body just inches away from hers. For the briefest second, the chase faded away. All he could hear was the sound of her steady breathing, the way her bioluminescent markings pulse slightly in response to their closeness. Her violet eyes flicked up to meet his, unreadable, dangerous, captivating this way. She whispered, her breath brushing against his cheek. Darren swallowed. Right, totally focused. Let's go. She pulled him forward again, navigating the city's hidden pathways with precision. And that was when Darren realized this wasn't the first time she had run from something. They didn't stop running until they reached an abandoned docking station near the city's industrial district. Massive loading cranes loomed overhead, casting long shadows against the flickering city lights. A few rusted, unregistered ships sat in the docking bay, no doubt belonging to smugglers or mercenaries looking to avoid corporate regulations. Valerie exhaled sharply, finally releasing Darren's wrist as she leaned against a nearby wall, catching her breath. Darren placed his hands on his hips, grinning. Despite the fact that they had just escaped being captured and possibly executed, well, he said that was fun. Valerie turned toward him, her expression unreadable. You are far too casual about all of this. Darren shrugged. Helps with the panic, she sighed, shaking her head before glancing up at the star-filled sky above them. I should not have done this, she murmured. I should have gone back. Darren studied her carefully, his smirk fading. Do you actually believe that? Valerie's markings dimmed slightly, her hands clenching at her sides. I don't know. It was the same answer she had given him earlier, the same uncertainty that had pushed her to make this choice in the first place. Darren took a step closer. You could have left me behind. Valerie looked at him, startled by the statement. You could have let them take you. Say I was some human idiot who got caught up in a misunderstanding. And you'd be fine, he continued. They'd have cleared your name, sent you back to your noble duties, erased this whole thing like it never happened. Valerie stayed silent. Darren tilted his head, stepping closer. But you didn't. She inhaled sharply, but didn't look away. Darren let a slow, knowing grin creep onto his face. You're choosing me, aren't you? Valerie bristled at the accusation. Do not be so arrogant, Darren, and chuckled. That wasn't a no. Valerie turned away, her markings flickering rapidly, betraying the storm of emotions running through her. Darren hesitated for just a moment, then, taking a risk, he reached out and gently caught her hand. She flinched, but didn't pull away. Her glowing markings brightened instantly at the contact, and a soft, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. Darren smirked. You felt that, didn't you? Valerie's jaw tightened. Of course I felt it. Her voice was barely a whisper now, her fingers twitching slightly in his grasp. Darren's grin softened, and this time he spoke without teasing. So what does that mean for us? Valerie closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling deeply. It means I am terrified. Darren smirk faltered. She opened her eyes again, and for the first time since they had met she looked vulnerable. This was never supposed to happen, she admitted. You and I, we are not meant to be. My people do not bind themselves to humans. My family will never accept this. Darren held her gaze, his own expression unreadable. And what do you want? Valerie swallowed. I don't know. Darren smiled. Then let's find out. She hesitated, then, before she could think too much about it, she pulled him closer and kissed him. It wasn't an accidental kiss this time. It wasn't a mistake, a misunderstanding, or a forced ritual. It was her choice, and the moment their lips met, a rush of warmth spread between them. Her markings flaring to life like a cosmic storm, Darren melted into it, his hands moving to rest against her waist, pulling her in like he had been waiting for this moment the entire time. When she finally pulled away, her breath was uneven, her glowing violet eyes filled with something new, something uncertain. But no longer fearful, Darren grinned, his hands still resting on her hips, so I'm guessing that was on purpose. This time Valerie rolled her eyes, but her lips curved just slightly at the edges. Yes, she murmured. Darren tilted his head. And what does it mean? Viri held his gaze for a long moment, then softly she whispered, I suppose it means I have chosen. Darren's grin widened. Well, then he murmured, leaning in again, guess I better make this worth the risk. And this time he kissed her back. The first rays of the artificial sunrise began to spill over Orion Nexus, casting a warm glow over the neon-lit city. The once abandoned docking station now buzzed with energy, with merchants, smugglers, and travelers preparing their ships for departure. And standing at the edge of it all, hand in hand, were Valerie and Darren. Valerie's bioluminescent markings pulsed softly, no longer flickering with hesitation or confusion. She had made her choice, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of it. Darren, his ever-present grin a little softer now, squeezed her hand. So I got to ask, what's the plan, princess? You sticking with me for good, or was that kiss just a thanks for the memories moment? Valerie rolled her eyes, but there was a playfulness in her expression now, a lightness that hadn't been there before. I do not make decisions lightly, she said, tilting her chin up. If I choose something, I see it through. Darren smirked. So that means I get to keep you? Valerie arched a brow, her markings shifting a teasing shade of violet. If you are fortunate enough to deserve me, yes. Darren chuckled. Oath. Sweetheart, you just gave me all the motivation I need. Valerie let out a soft laugh, shaking her head, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned toward the docking platform, where a small but reliable-looking starship sat waiting. It wasn't elegant or noble, it was scrappy, dented, and undoubtedly stolen at some point in its history. Perfect. We need to leave before my family finds us, Valerie said, her tone serious again. The fact that I chose this path does not mean they will accept it. They will try to take me back by force, if necessary. Darren's grin faded just slightly. You sure you want to give up everything for this? For me? Valerie turned to him, her glowing violet eyes unwavering. I am not giving up anything, Darren. I am choosing my own future for the first time. Darren stared at her for a moment before letting out a slow whistle. Dan, I knew I'd liked you, but now I think I might be completely obsessed. Viri smirked. Good. You should be. Darren laughed, tugging her toward the ship. Come on, let's get out of here before your bodyguard shows up and tries to break my ribs again. As if on cue, a deep, familiar voice echoed from behind them. Valerie. They both froze. Darren muttered, of course. Viri turned slowly to find Shiori standing at the entrance to the docking bay, his massive frame blocking the exit like a living wall. His golden eyes flicked between them before settling on Valerie. You do not have to do this, Zori said, his tone uncharacteristically calm. You still have a place among our people. Your family will forgive you if you return now. Valerie held his gaze. And if I refuse? Shiori exhaled heavily. Then I will be forced to stop you. Darren groaned. Man, I was hoping we could skip the part where I get beat up. Viri stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Chorus's armored chest. You have protected me all my life, she said softly. I will always respect you for that. But this is my choice, and I am asking you not as a warrior, but as my oldest friend. Let me go for the first time. Shore hesitated. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally the massive warrior exhaled and stepped aside. Darren blinked. Wait, just like that? No punches, no epic last-minute duel. Shiori shot him a glare. Do not test me, human. Valerie smirked, taking Darren's hand again. Come on before he changes his mind. Darren nodded quickly, tugging her toward the ship. Right, leaving now. As they climbed into the cockpit, Darren powered up the engines, feeling the familiar hum of the ship vibrating beneath them. He turned to Vi, flashing her a cocky grin. Ready for your first adventure as a fugitive? Vera rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the excitement flickering in her expression. As long as it does not involve more public restrooms. Darren barked a laugh, setting the ship into motion. Deal. As they soared into the stars, leaving Orion Nexus behind, Valerie let out a slow breath, watching the planet shrink beneath them. For the first time in her life she was free, and as Darren reached over to lace his fingers through hers, she realized something else too. She was happy. and that was worth everything. The end.